In Essential Task 3.2, we are going to talk about what's called attitude formation. Attitude is another one of those words that we commonly use culturally, but has a very specific definition. I advise for Essential Task 3.2 a horizontal concept map. If you take a look, we were going to define what attitude is at the very top. And then there are three separate columns. The column all the way to the right has a breakdown on that sort of secondary level. So in total, we're looking at approximately 6-7 boxes, one at the top and then 6 sort of in that secondary level. I'll go back to the task of the text of the essential task so you can pause before transitioning into the concept map. We'll start at the very top. When we use the word attitude, what we are talking about are feelings that predispose us to respond in a certain way. So the term predispose, this is going to be the first time that we use this word in this course, but it just makes you more likely or more inclined to do something. So later this year, when we get to the biology unit, we're going to be talking about biological predispositions, which are predispositions for certain behaviors just due to the fact that we're humans. So, for example, a biological predisposition might be sort of the ingrained fear of something like snakes, a generically threatening an animal in our environment. So that's the way you could use predisposition in a future unit. In this unit, though, we're going to be talking about feelings, attitudes that predispose us to feel a certain way and respond in a certain way. And these will make a little bit more sense when we talk about them. But in the course of this essential task, we're going to be talking about a concept called cognitive dissonance. We're going to be talking about persuasion, and we're going to be talking about compliance. And we're also going to be talking about some of the elements of compliance. We'll start, though, all the way on the left and identify a concept called cognitive dissonance. This is an extremely common term on the AP exam. The actual individual responsible for this term, Leon Festinger, isn't a key psychologist. I don't commonly see his name on the AP exam. However, I see the concept of cognitive dissonance frequently on the AP exam. It's been an FRQ bullet before. It's very commonly in the multiple choice. And it's actually a somewhat challenging term to approach in an FRQ, and we'll talk about why in just a second. But cognitive dissonance is sort of a 3-step process or a 3-step concept. The first step is that an individual has 2 contradictory beliefs, or in some cases, behaviors. As a result of that contradiction, that person feels discomfort, and in order to reduce that discomfort, the individual does something. And we'll talk about what exactly that looks like in a second. This is really 3 steps. 2 contradictory thoughts, discomfort, and then actually trying to do something to reduce that discomfort. And it'll make more sense when I give you an example. If you ask basically anybody that smokes, they'll tell you that they know it causes health problems. However, if they choose to smoke, they clearly are doing a behavior that is disconnected from that belief because they know it's bad for you, but they do it anyway. An individual who smokes probably has cognitive dissonance every time they choose to go smoke. However, they found a way to reduce that discomfort. And for somebody who smokes, that might be as easy as telling themselves, it helps me stay relaxed. It helps me focus in school. It helps me get through the workday. They have to convince themselves in some way, shape, or form that in that case, smoking isn't as bad as it seems, discounting or ignoring the health consequences. And now that individual might have these 2 contradictory beliefs, but that discomfort that they feel from smoking isn't all that significant because they've convinced themselves that there's actually a benefit to it. We call that experience cognitive dissonance. So again, you don't have to copy down the whole text of the example, but it's there as an example. And in the corresponding documents that go along with this concept map, there's a visual that we use to represent this. But that's a great example. A person knows that smoking causes health problems. They know that smoking is bad, but that person still chooses to smoke. Well, that person is experiencing cognitive dissonance. And really the only way around that is to proceed down to the box below, which is to resolve your cognitive dissonance. So again, I don't work for Big Tobacco. I'm not going to try and convince you to smoke. I'm just going to try and outline what an individual who smokes might tell themselves in order to convince themselves that it's actually not as bad. So there's really 3 common ways to reduce your cognitive dissonance or to resolve your cognitive dissonance. The first is to totally change your attitude. So change one side of the spectrum. If the options are either smoking is bad for my health and I really like smoking, you have to change one of those. And if you convince yourself that for whatever reason, smoking isn't that bad, I mean, I know people who say something like, oh, well, I'm going to die anyway, or I already eat poorly, or I already do all of these other unhealthy behaviors. All of a sudden, that person has convinced themselves that the health consequences of smoking really aren't that significant. That person has changed their attitude pertaining to smoking. They've convinced themselves that that side isn't as overwhelming, and now they don't feel as much discomfort. Because again, cognitive dissonance is two contradictory thoughts, feeling discomfort, and that third part is the most important, really, trying to resolve that discomfort. The next way to potentially reduce your cognitive dissonance and this discomfort that you feel is to make one side overwhelming. So even though the two sides contradict each other, one side is so overwhelmingly beneficial, you no longer feel that discomfort. And perhaps you could convince yourself that smoking is actually super beneficial, that it calms you down. And now you acknowledge the health consequences, but the positive side of smoking, that it calms you down or helps you focus, is so overwhelming, you discredit or discount that negative, and now you no longer feel discomfort. The cognitive dissonance has been resolved. The third way is to make one side less important. So, for example, if you reduce one side of the spectrum and convince yourself that your health actually isn't all that important right now all of a sudden the health consequences of smoking don't really matter. So, for example, you might convince yourself, you're really young, and if you only do it for a few years when you're really young, it's not really going to impact your health all that much anyway, which is probably a lie. But nevertheless, you can convince yourself of that. And now that side about smoking isn't all that overwhelming. And now you might be able to continue smoking and not experience that discomfort. What makes this concept challenging in an FRQ bullet is to answer it appropriately based on sort of the historical precedent. You would need to define it as two contradictory thoughts or behaviors. The act of smoking can count. So two contradictory thoughts or behaviors, discomfort that you experience or tension that you experience because of that, and this third part's really important, and actually telling yourself or doing something to reduce that level of discomfort. Most students can define those first two and include those first two, but have a really difficult time addressing that third element. So it's really pivotal that if you see this in an FRQ, you also talk about how the individual in the prompt actually convinces themselves using one of the three ways you see in front of you of one thing or another that overall reduces that tension, because that part's pivotal. Cognitive dissonance theory is all about that last portion. How do you go about resolving that discomfort? Whether you change your attitude, overwhelm one side, or reduce the run side of it. Proceeding onward, we're going to now be talking about persuasion. Persuasion is just one box, but it's sort of a two-column where there'll be two separate terms side by side to each other. Persuasion is when you try to convince somebody to buy a certain product or follow you politically or anything where you're trying to persuade someone into one direction or the other. There's two different types, one called peripheral route to persuasion and the other called central route to persuasion. We define them here, and then below I will provide a brief and quick mnemonic for both of them. So if you've been keeping up with mnemonics as I can show you here, it'd be worthwhile to leave that space. These two together are what we call the elaboration likelihood model. I don't often see that word in the AP exam, but I do like to give you the heading that each of these two persuasion techniques technically fall under that. The peripheral route to persuasion is when you try and persuade somebody, but you use emotions. You use what I call positive or negative cues. So this is really when they try and pull at those heartstrings, where they really try and grab you emotionally. So I'm talking about commercials that have celebrities in it, songs, slogans, color, maybe perhaps the speaker in the commercial you'd consider attractive, or the individual is objectively attractive. You were talking about those really emotional pulls to try and get someone to buy a product or support a specific political candidate or support an entire belief politically. Anytime you see those types of commercials, those are peripheral route to persuasion. They differ considerably from what we call central route to persuasion, where a commercial or an ad or just a back and forth conversation with somebody is entirely fact and logic driven. So if you ever see a commercial and it's all about facts, it's all about statistics, and it's trying to persuade you to vote for something or buy something, you're experiencing somebody's trying to use the central route to persuasion. And honestly, if you kind of reflect on what you see on TV, you see a lot of peripheral route, the one on the left. So whether you open up a magazine or you watch television, you see a lot of ads with celebrities, with slogans, with catchy ringtones or catchy slogans or catchy jingles. Anytime one of those commercials gets stuck in your head, that company is using that peripheral route to persuasion. You do see it, but you don't often see the central route as much. Commercials and advertisements that are just all fact-driven, all stat-driven. You can sometimes see it with something like car commercials. They really warrant that central route to persuasion. But if you look at sort of the totality of what you see on TV, a lot of it is peripheral route. As a mnemonic to differentiate these, so to differentiate them, we have to use either the word peripheral or central, because they both share route to persuasion. But when I look at peripheral, I see that letter P and H, especially the two in the middle, and I think of the words pretty and humor. Peripheral route to persuasion, advertisements, commercials, or just back and forth conversations tend to either be attractive just visually or tend to use sort of pretty celebrities. I mean, whether it's Tom Brady or somebody else, anytime a celebrity is used to try and sell you something, that company is using the peripheral route to persuasion by trying to persuade you with that emotional connection or positive cue that you might have to Tom Brady. Or humor. Anytime a commercial has just a bunch of humor in it, it's a funny commercial, like the ones during the Super Bowl, all of that's peripheral route to persuasion. On the other hand, I know it's not spelt like this, but central route to persuasion techniques actually make sense. So if you play around with the beginning of the word central and the word sense, actually makes logical sense. You can kind of connect those two. And I've alluded to this a lot in the context of a commercial, because that's often where you see it. But this can also happen just back and forth conversation. So if you walk up to somebody and say, hey, I think you really should support this cause, and the person's like, well, why? And be like, well, look, the speaker at the rally that we're at, they're really attractive. I really think we should support them. That doesn't make a lot of logical sense, but that might hit you emotionally. Or if somebody says, listen to that speaker, they're incredibly persuasive. They have great logic and great reasoning. Well, if you approach somebody and try and persuade them that way, it's central route. So although we use commercials a lot to evaluate these two terms, it also can happen just in one-on-one back and forth conversation. The last thing to talk about is the concept of compliance. And we're going to, in many ways, contrast compliance with obedience from Essential Task 3.1. When you comply to someone or something in the context of an institution, you are simply changing your behavior because of a direct request from another person. However, and this is the key, that person is not a figure of authority, or that institution is not a figure of authority. So I gave the example in class, but if a coworker asks you to grab something in the back and you choose to do it, and that coworker is at the same level, there's no authority, there's no power difference between you and that coworker, you're complying to their request, you're not obeying. They're not a figure of authority. It's different from the Milgram study. So if somebody who is your equal asks you to do something and you do it, you're complying. Stranger, coworker, etc. Or an institution. So for example, as you're applying for college, a bunch of universities have deadlines. Because you are not yet a student, something like UMass Lowell or UMass Amherst or Dartmouth or wherever it is that you choose to go, they're not technically an authority figure in your life yet. So because you are changing your behavior as a result of a direct request from, in that case, an institution, it still classifies as complying. So you're complying to the rules of the institution by applying on time. But you're not obeying them. They are not a figure of authority in your life just yet. So it's important to make that distinction. If it's your boss, if it's anything like that, that's obedience. There are two techniques that can commonly cause an individual to comply. You see these a lot in marketing. You see these a lot on the floor of the mall, which will make a lot of sense in just a moment. We call these foot in the door and door in the face phenomenon. And they're basically opposites of one another. So if you can follow the first, the other one is the complete opposite, at least the inverse. If we were in class, we would be doing a demo. It would involve me trying to illustrate foot in the door phenomenon. Can't really replicate it through Prezi though. But when you demonstrate foot in the door phenomenon, what you're doing is a compliance strategy again. So you're trying to get somebody who might not necessarily be below you. So this isn't an obedience situation. You're just trying to get an average everyday person to change their behavior as a result of your request. And it occurs like this. You first ask somebody to do something really easy. Like, hey, could you take your phone out? Or, hey, could I stop and ask you a question? Or, hey, do you have $1 as a donation? You ask somebody something that's usually pretty easy to agree to. Stop and ask a question, things like that. And once that first request has been met, you follow it up with a second request that's a little bit bigger. And you can actually continue to go. It doesn't have to just be 2 requests. But you incrementally increase how significant of a request you're making until you ultimately ask the actual thing that you're trying to request. So, for example, if you've ever been stopped at the mall, you might see somebody come up to you at the kiosk and say, hey, can I ask you a quick question? To respond to a quick question in and of itself is not a challenging request. It's actually very easy to not only agree to, but to fulfill. Once that individual, though, follows up and says, now that we're talking, now that you have your foot in the door and you're partially committed to this interaction, would you now be interested in holding this new iPhone? And now, next thing you know, you went from a simple conversation that you agreed to, and now you're holding a new iPhone. And now the person says, well, now that you're holding that iPhone, do you want to buy the new iPhone? So all of a sudden you agree to a really small request, just talking to someone. And now all of a sudden you've been provided this massive request of buying a new iPhone or spending a lot of money on this item. Well, that salesperson is using what we call foot in the door phenomenon, where if you get somebody to agree to a really small request at first, you can incrementally build up until it's the large request that you're actually targeting. Try this at home. Try this with a brother or sister or sibling. You're on the couch, you're watching the sports game, you're watching a TV show, a movie, or whatever it is, kind of out of the blue to one of your friends or your family members. Hey, could you get up real quick? It's not hard to stand up. So the person might actually do that. Then you can say, well, now that you're standing, any chance do you want to go to the fridge and get me a snack? That person is way more likely to actually go get you the snack now that they're standing up because they feel partially invested in it because they've already, as the term indicates, gotten their foot in the door by complying to that for a small request. It works great. So start small, go bigger. You can ask your sibling, hey, could you come over here real quick? Well, now that you're over here, can you take the trash out? Something that you never do. The opposite end of this is what we call door in the face. And there's a mnemonic right below here that's going to conclude today. So once you finish this box, there is a little space there for a mnemonic. But door in the face is just the sort of opposite direction. Instead of starting really small, with door in the face, you start way over the top, something you would never anticipate somebody accepting. So you call up your brother or sister and say, hey, could you rake all of the leaves this weekend? I have to go away. Or, hey, would you be willing to donate $1,000 to this political campaign? Or, hey, would you be willing to volunteer your weekend to be part of this food drive? You request something that you know the person is not likely to agree to, and then you actually target it up and follow it with your intended request. And that's the key here. You didn't anticipate them. You didn't even necessarily want them to agree to the big request. You actually wanted them to agree to the smaller request. So what you do is you ask something ridiculous and then target the actual thing you wanted. So if you wanted to get your brother or sister to take the trash out, say, will you rake all the leaves this weekend while I'm away? They're going to say no. And then you can follow it up with, well, could you at least take the trash out? Is that an easy compromise? Now all of a sudden you, making this request, seem like the nice person in this interaction. The person that you are talking to all of a sudden feels like, well, I just said no to them. I can't say no twice, can I? When in reality, the person making these requests, they just kind of tricked you. They use door in the face phenomenon. They set you up by starting big, knowing you'd reject it, and then targeting the thing that they actually wanted you to do. It's a great trick. Try it with a brother or sister, significant other, best friend. These are actually really quite effective. Try it with a teacher. Ask for, hey, can we have an extra 2 weeks on this essay? Most teachers will say no and then say, well, can you at least give us an extra 2 days? When in reality, that's all you really wanted. As a quick mnemonic here, when I look at the words door in the face and foot in the door, I notice the letters D and F, sort of differentiating those first and fourth words. And I think about grades, F being the worst grade, D being a little bit better. When you look at the order of foot in the door, it starts with an F and then goes to D. So it starts with really low grades and then ends with at least a little bit higher in grades. So small to big, F to D. And so you don't flip them accidentally. Door in the face is just the opposite. High grades to a little bit lower grades, D to F. So if you isolate the F and the D in these two words and you think small to big, lower grades to a little bit higher, or in the inverse, high grades to a little bit lower, you'll be able to differentiate the order. Because that's really the thing that most students confuse is the order. Foot in the door is small request to big, big being the one you actually want the person to do. Door in the face is ridiculous, don't anticipate them to say yes, and actually then target the one that you intend, the much smaller request. So think grades when you're talking about foot in the door and door in the face.